January 26, 1945. Holtzwihr, a ruined thumb of a village in Alsace, France. Snow crusted the hedgerows. A hard blue wind bit through collars and canvas. The sky hung low and iron grey. The ground smelled of wet earth and burning oil, a metallic, sweet stench that never seemed to leave the mouths of men who had fought too long. Men moved like shadows between ruined houses, boots crunching on frozen mud, breath clouding in the pale air. In the ruined lane near a farmstead creaking with cracked timbers, Lieutenant Audie Murphy of Company B, 15th Infantry, 3rd Infantry Division, sat hunched beside a knocked-out M10 tank destroyer. The vehicle's flank had been punched open by shell fragments. Its engine coughed smoke and small flames licked at the armor. Nearby, 2 stretcher-bearers tried in vain to quiet the terrified cry of a wounded rifleman. The lieutenant's uniform was powdered with soot. His hands were already raw from yanking a bandage over a slashed forearm. On the hood of the M10 lay an emptied ration tin, and beside it, the cold iron of a .45 Colt and the stubby silhouette of a carbine. He had the look of a man who had been bent and bent again until something inside had learned to keep its shape. At 5'2", broad-shouldered but small enough that older soldiers still teased him, Murphy had been told once, back home and in recruiting offices, that he was too small to fight. He had heard it more than once. Dismissive chuckles from recruiting sergeants, short forms stamped underweight, the wary looks of men who thought war was measured in inches and pounds. Those refusals had been a kind of fuel. When the German counterattack rolled out of the trees like a hungry tide, he moved as if that old dismissal had been a spark. The lull did not last. From the tree line to the east came the low howl of engines, not the thin whine of half-tracks, but a meaner, fuller sound. Panzers. Through the grey they appeared, black silhouettes against the snow, panzer oars and a brace of assault guns, their tracks shredding hedgerows, headlights cutting cold beams through smoke. Infantry hugged their flanks, human shadows moving with the tanks like wolves around a boar. Murphy's company was holding the line thinly spread across the ruined orchards. Their bars, Browning automatic rifles, and M1 Garands kept up a ragged stutter of fire, but shells found dead ground and foxholes opened and closed with the sick suction of explosives. Men shouted in clipped voices that were already hoarse, "Artillery! Call artillery!" The telephone lines were gone. Radios were patchwork at best. The enemy pressed. Lieutenant Murphy pushed himself to his feet and climbed onto the smoking M10. The vehicle's pintle-mounted M250 caliber machine gun, a heavy, righteous thing of iron and brass, had been abandoned when its crew were forced down by a concussion. The mount was hot, the protective shield splattered with the grey-black of explosive residue. He had no time to consider the risk. His hands found the weapon with the ease of someone who had learned to make a tool into an extension of himself. Below him, the men of Company B watched with a kind of stunned hunger. Murphy's face, in profile against the ash-colored sky, had a small boat intensity. He set the gun's sights, feeling the recoil in his shoulders even before the first tracer stitched the air. He fired. The .50's report cracked the wind like a pistol shot. Its tracers leapt forward and found an armored flank, and for a stunned, fragile second, the world froze. A shell of bright smoke and an answering flare as metal bit metal. They came at his position in waves. First came the infantry. Ragged, desperate, their faces masked by scarves, rifles flung low in the white and brown underbrush. Then came a column of half-tracks, their sides pocked and bleeding smoke. Finally, from the hollow, the tanks rolled, their turrets cutting the light. Commanders silhouetted at cupolas, machine gun crews like black beetles. The M10, though dying, still offered a perch and a field of fire. Murphy rode that perch like a man who had learned to use the world's dangers as leverage. He fired solo, sweeping the machine gun across the approaching ranks. One burst pinned an enemy squad to an orchard fence. Another ate the hood of a half-track and sent a soldier tumbling into the snow. Shouts of alarm and the smell of cordite grew with each exchange. He called to the other men, terse, urgent, "Hold! Hold your fire! Left flank! Left flank!" And somehow the men obeyed, shaping themselves around the thin line his gun drew. His voice was small, but it cut like flint. A shell found the M10's rear deck and detonated, showering Murphy with hot fragments. Pain lanced his leg, a shock that sharpened his awareness rather than dulled it. Blood began to stitch dark lines through the snow at his boots. Men down the lane shouted, and someone, a shuddering corporal named William, started a running wedge to drag him back. Murphy waved him off. The command to fall back would have been merciful. Instead, he leaned into the gun and kept holding the line. "You don't get to leave," he told the smoke. Maybe he spoke to the shell of the man who'd been turned away in recruiting offices, or maybe he spoke to the soldiers behind him who were still young enough to count birthdays in single digits. He opened an eye and saw advancing armor only yards away, steel plates that glinted like a promise of finality. He could hear, beneath the thunder, the sharp, high order of machine gun fire and a smaller sound, the squeal of track pins. Between bursts, he did something no one in his company would forget. He called for mortar and artillery adjustments, using voice and hand signals to point the artillery officers toward the enemy's flank. He became, improbably, the axis around which the unit's defense folded. He was small enough to squeeze into spaces others couldn't, but his presence filled the road like a wall. Memory, always partial in war, remembered more than the facts. It remembered the layer of mud that cracked on his boots, the way breath fogged in white plumes, the rasp of that .50 as if the gun itself was a beast breathing, the tinny click of the emptying magazine. It remembered the old recruiting sergeant's dismissive words, now iron in the teeth of a man who had found a use for every inch of himself. Around him, men he had fought beside since Italy and the Hürtgen forest moved with the fragile coordinations of exhausted people who still knew how to kill a moment's advantage. A German officer, helmet polished to a dull shine, peered out and tried to direct the advance. The tank commander shrugged, and the gun of an approaching Panzerwaffe swung and sent a shell that kissed the smoke-raised hedge and showered mud like rain. The lieutenant felt the hot particulates sting his face. His jaw stayed set. His fingers squeezed the trigger with the steadiness of someone who had decided that fear was merely detail. When the first true counterstroke of Allied artillery answered his call, the field lit with a terrible, purifying light. Spindrifts of earth erupted, trees that had been sentries were unmade, and the German advance took the taste of iron and wood. For a span that stretched like an elastic band pulled taut, Murphy's 50 cut and the artillery answered, and the panzer crews found their way cluttered with smoke and falling debris. Men cheered in small, shocked bursts. The line held, for now. But victory was not a single blow. Wounds throbbed under the uniform, and men who had been younger than him when they left home for induction centers were now iron-faced and tired. Murphy climbed down from the machine gun only when flares burned out, and the living around him needed him to pass a tourniquet, to fill a foxhole, to tie a bootlace. When he descended, his hand left the metal warm and oily, and the place of his fingers dark with smoke. He walked back toward Company B as if the day had been simply another duty. Only when he reached the foxholes did the depth of what had happened press in. Men looked at him like you might look at a person who had been through a storm and come out wearing the sky. Someone slapped him on the shoulder, hard enough to make him wince. The slaps carried more than congratulations. They carried the pragmatic gratitude of men who had been spared that day because one small man refused to be small. In that ruined lane, with the sun low and the cry of geese faint in the distance, Audie Murphy, the lieutenant who had been told he was too small to fight, pocketed a cigarette he had no intention of smoking and stared into the field where the Germans had halted. The war had not ended. Men still bled. Towns still burned. But for a thin, bright hour, He had been the hinge on which a little patch of France turned away from disaster. Before Holtzwihr, before the smoke and frozen mud, there was a dirt road in Texas and a boy who carried more weight than his body ever should have. Audie Murphy was born on June 20th, 1925, near Kingston, Texas, a place that was more dust than town. His family lived in a weather-worn shack surrounded by cotton fields that seemed to stretch forever, and work began when the sun rose and didn't end until darkness made it impossible to see. He was one of 12 children, the son of a sharecropper who left when Audie was still young. His mother, Josie Bell, worked herself to exhaustion just keeping food on the table. By 10, Audie was the man of the house. He learned to shoot not from any desire for glory, but because rabbits and squirrels were the difference between supper and hunger. A single shot meant meat. 2 shots meant he'd missed, and they couldn't afford misses. He grew up thin, wiry, with the eyes of someone who noticed everything because he couldn't afford not to. When America was pulled into war after Pearl Harbor, Murphy was 16. He watched from the living room of a neighbor's house as President Roosevelt's voice trembled through the radio, calling for the defense of freedom. He remembered his mother's tired expression, the pride mixed with fear that rippled through the room. The next day, he told his siblings he was going to enlist. He was turned down instantly. The Army said he was too short. The Navy said he was too light. The Marines, the very branch that drew every young man who wanted to prove himself, laughed. At 5'2" and barely 112 pounds, Murphy didn't look like the kind of man who could carry a rifle, let alone a squad through hell. But he didn't stop. He tried again and again, shaving months off his age, forging papers, begging recruiters to take him. Eventually, with the help of his older sister Corinne, who falsified his birth certificate, he was accepted into the Army at 17. When she saw him off, she kissed his cheek and said, "Don't let them break you." They tried. Basic training at Camp Walters, Texas, nearly did. Murphy's sighs drew laughter. His endurance, though, made others go quiet. He could run until his legs gave out and shoot straighter than anyone on the range. Drill sergeants who mocked him at first began using him as an example. Still, some said he was too gentle, too quiet, too young. They couldn't see the fire inside the silence. When orders came for overseas deployment in 1943, Murphy shipped to North Africa, then Italy, the crucible of the 3rd Infantry Division. There, the hills were steep, the mud deep, and death waited behind every stone wall. The boy from Texas became a soldier in the only way a man can, by surviving what should have killed him. Salerno, Anzio, the Volturno River. At each, he showed the same stubborn refusal to yield. He moved faster, thought sharper, fought longer than anyone expected. He wasn't reckless. He was exact. In Sicily, he watched a friend die to sniper fire and afterward took the position with a single, careful shot. In Anzio, he endured months in trenches under constant bombardment, lice, hunger, fever, and somehow emerged steadier than before. By the time the 3rd Division moved into southern France in 1944, Murphy was no longer a boy. He had been promoted to sergeant, then a staff sergeant, and finally to lieutenant. His men followed him because he didn't ask them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. They said he was lucky. Maybe he was. But Murphy never believed in luck, only in endurance. He believed the difference between living and dying was often no thicker than a heartbeat, and that most men died because fear made them hesitate. He refused to hesitate. It was in France, near Ramatuelle, that Murphy first earned the Distinguished Service Cross. A German machine gun had pinned his platoon down, cutting the grass inches from their helmets. Murphy crawled forward alone, under fire so intense the ground smoked, and killed the entire crew with grenades and rifle fire. When his men caught up, he was sitting in the dirt, silent, breathing through clenched teeth. "Let's move," was all he said. He would go on to fight through the Vosges, pushing through rain and freezing wind. By then, the medals had begun to pile up. Bronze stars, silver stars. But the weight of them didn't slow him. If anything, they made him quieter. His letters home spoke not of heroism, but of loss. "I don't know how I'm still here," he wrote once. "Maybe I'm too small for the bullets to find me." By the winter of 1945, the 3rd Infantry Division was fighting through eastern France, pushing toward the Rhine. Company B had been bled down to half its strength, and supply lines were stretched thin. The Germans were desperate, striking with anything left that could move or shoot. And then came Holtzwihr, a name that would become synonymous with one man standing against an army. But the miracle of that day wasn't born on a battlefield. It was born years before, in a Texas field where a hungry boy learned to keep his aim steady, where being small meant learning to move fast, and where survival had already been his daily war. When the tanks came roaring out of the woods that January morning, Murphy wasn't fighting just to hold a line. He was fighting to prove, one last time, that the world had been wrong about him. January 26, 1945, the day that would carve Audie Murphy's name into the bedrock of military history. The 3rd Infantry Division was tasked with holding the approach to the town of Holtzwihr, guarding against a German counterattack aimed to break through to the Colmar pocket. Company B, Murphy's company, was positioned along a frozen road bordered by woods and open fields, an unforgiving stretch of land that offered little cover and no forgiveness. The snow came in thin, swirling veils that blurred the tree line ahead. Murphy, now commanding what remained of Company B, stood over a map spread across the hood of a jeep. The paper flapped in the cold wind as he traced positions with a pencil. His men were exhausted, 20 strong from an original force of 120. Their faces were drawn, boots stiff with frost, eyes red from sleepless nights. They had fought too long, too hard, for too little. The morning silence broke with the low, rumbling growl of diesel engines. The Germans were coming. Scouts spotted them first, tanks, half-tracks, and waves of infantry pushing forward under a screen of artillery. Shells began to fall in the distance, hollow thumps that grew closer until the air itself trembled. Murphy ordered his men to dig in along the tree line and hold. He radioed for artillery support, calling coordinates in clipped tones, then moved among the foxholes, offering the same steady calm he always did. He carried no illusions. He knew this was it. Their position couldn't hold under armor for long. But he also knew that a retreat here would open the road to the entire battalion. When the first German shells struck, the world turned white and red. Earth exploded, branches shattered, and men hugged the frozen soil as dirt and shrapnel rained down. The tanks rolled closer, black crosses visible through the haze, their machine guns lashing the tree line with streaks of fire. Murphy's M10 tank destroyer, positioned forward, took a direct hit. Flames shot through the turret as the crew bailed out, coughing and bleeding. The lieutenant shouted for his men to fall back to secondary positions, to regroup, form a new line. But he stayed. The wounded needed cover, and someone had to hold the enemy long enough for the artillery to respond. He climbed onto the burning M10, ignoring the blast of heat that seared through his gloves. The .50 caliber machine gun was still mounted on the turret, its barrel gleaming dull silver through soot. Without hesitation, Murphy swung it toward the approaching enemy and squeezed the trigger. The gun thundered. Tracers tore through the morning fog, slicing into the advancing infantry. The first German ranks stumbled and fell, but more came, pressing forward over the bodies of their comrades. The air filled with the harsh metallic roar of automatic fire and the heavier, slower booms of tank shells. Murphy called artillery coordinates even as he fought, his voice hoarse but steady, through the radio handset. Explosions began to fall among the German formations, shattering vehicles, scattering men. Still, they advanced. The burning M10 rocked with every impact. Fragment of metal and stone bit into Murphy's face and hands. He was bleeding, half deaf, nearly out of ammunition. And yet, He refused to leave. At one point, a German infantry squad tried to flank the position. Murphy swung the gun and cut them down in seconds. When another tank veered toward him, he shifted his fire to the exposed crewmen riding on the hull, dropping them one by one. The battlefield became a blur of noise and motion, a nightmare lit by the orange pulse of explosions and the hard white glare of snow reflecting fire. Below, his men watched in disbelief. They could barely comprehend what they were seeing. One man, silhouetted against the flames, firing until the gun steamed and smoked. Each burst was a defiance. Each reload a small act of rage against the idea that anything larger, stronger, or louder could break him. For nearly an hour, he held. The Germans, confused and pinned, began to withdraw. The last tank shell landed close enough to knock Murphy flat, his head ringing, his leg torn by shrapnel. But when he pushed himself up again, the enemy was gone. He limped back to his men, face black with soot, eyes bright and unfocused. "Let's counterattack," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the snow like a command from somewhere beyond exhaustion, and they followed. Together, the remnants of Company B moved back through the wreckage, clearing what remained of the German positions. They retook the ground they'd nearly lost. Ground that had been held by one man and one machine gun against an entire company of tanks and infantry. When the smoke cleared, the field was silent except for the hiss of cooling metal. Dozens of enemy bodies lay scattered across the snow. The air reeked of oil and cordite. And somewhere amid the silence, the faint crackle of a burning tank sounded almost peaceful. Audie Murphy sank to one knee beside the wreck of the M10. His leg throbbed, his hands shook, but his heart was steady. For all his defiance, he had not fought out of rage or glory. He had fought because his men needed time, and because he could not bear the thought of leaving them behind. That day, he turned the impossible into fact. He had done what no one of his size, no one of his supposed weakness, should have been able to do. And the war had not yet finished with him. When the echoes of gunfire finally died away at Holtzwihr, the world seemed to hold its breath. Snow continued to fall in slow, indifferent flakes, settling over the wreckage of men and metal. The air reeked of spent powder, smoke, and blood. The perfume of victory that never smelled like triumph to those who survived it. Audie Murphy was carried to the rear line by two medics. His leg was bleeding freely, his right hand blistered from the heat of the .50 caliber. He said little, only that he needed to know how many of his men were alive. When the corpsman told him fewer than 20, he nodded once and looked away. For his actions at Holtzwihr, Lieutenant Murphy would receive the Medal of Honor, the United States' highest military award for valor. His official citation would speak of conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, but the words, as polished as they sounded, couldn't begin to describe what had truly happened that day. Among the men of Company B, the story spread quietly. How Murphy had held the line alone, how he'd called artillery fire almost on top of himself, how he'd refused evacuation until the enemy was repelled. By the time headquarters wrote the reports, the tale had already become legend. But the war did not end for Audie Murphy that winter. He continued to fight through the final push into Germany, each step a blur of exhaustion and survival. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, he was 20 years old. A soldier who had spent nearly 2 years in continuous combat and survived. 20 years old, and already the most decorated American soldier of the Second World War. 1 Medal of Honor, 1 Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, 2 Bronze Stars, 3 Purple Hearts, the French Legion of Honor, the Croix de Guerre, and more than 30 other awards and citations for valor. But medals don't heal nightmares. When Murphy returned home to Texas, the parades and ceremonies followed him like shadows. He smiled when he was supposed to, saluted when the cameras turned, but at night, the war came back. Not as glory, but as sound and fire. He woke drenched in sweat, his hand reaching for a pistol that wasn't there. Thunderclaps made him flinch. The smell of gasoline or burning wood twisted his stomach. They didn't have a name for it then. Battle fatigue, they called it. But we know it now as post-traumatic stress. He tried to return to ordinary life, but the quiet of peacetime felt foreign. The boy who had grown up with hunger and war didn't know what to do with calm. His mother had died while he was overseas, and the farm was gone. All that remained was his name, and a world that suddenly wanted to make him into something larger than life. Hollywood came calling. Actor James Cagney, impressed by Murphy's appearance on the cover of Life magazine, invited him to California. There, for the first time, Audie Murphy traded his rifle for a script. He took acting lessons, read lines, tried to find himself in a world of lights and cameras. But even as he smiled for the screen, the war never left him. In 1955, a decade after Holtzwihr, Murphy starred in To Hell and Back, a film based on his own memoir. He played himself. Scene by scene, he relived the battles, the loss, the weight of survival. On set, the director noticed something remarkable. Between takes, Murphy would sit in silence, staring at the ground, as if listening for distant thunder that only he could hear. When the movie premiered, it became one of the most successful war films of its time. America saw a hero, small, soft-spoken, wearing the uniform of legend. But the man beneath the medals carried invisible scars. He refused to glorify what he'd done. "There's nothing brave about killing," he told an interviewer once. "It's just that sometimes you can't help it." Murphy used his fame not to boast, but to advocate. He spoke about veterans' struggles long before it was common to do so, urging the government to recognize the psychological toll of war. He understood that the wounds no one could see were often the hardest to survive. Yet even in the midst of the noise and fame, he remained simple in his habits, soft-spoken, polite, and private. He raised horses, wrote poetry, and spent his spare time on quiet ranches away from the city. Friends described him as a man divided, half hero, half ghost, a soldier still listening for the echo of his own gunfire. The years passed, and Murphy aged into a reluctant icon, not because he sought the spotlight, but because he never could escape it. To a nation searching for symbols, he was the perfect story, the poor Texas farm boy who had been too small to fight, who became the bravest man on the battlefield. But Audie Murphy knew the truth. He had not fought to be remembered. He had fought because no one else would. The years after the war drifted by like smoke over an old battlefield, beautiful from a distance, heavy up close. Audie Murphy lived them quietly, always with a trace of restlessness in his step. Hollywood gave him a living, not peace. Fame brought comfort, not sleep. He acted in more than 40 films, most of them westerns, stories of lone men fighting for justice on empty frontiers. Audie never said it aloud, but friends noticed he was drawn to those roles because they mirrored the life he understood best. A man outnumbered, standing his ground. Yet on screen, he could choose when the battle ended. Off screen, he still fought invisible wars. He slept with a pistol under his pillow. He avoided fireworks and crowded places. Once, he woke in the night, thinking he was back in France, and crawled out a window before realizing where he was. He laughed it off the next morning, but the laughter never reached his eyes. Still, he tried to use what the war had made of him. Murphy became one of the earliest public figures to speak about the unseen wounds soldiers carried home. He appeared before Congress, arguing for better mental health care for veterans. He donated his earnings to help those who couldn't find work or stability after service. "They trained us to fight," he once said, "but not to live again." In the 1960s, as America entered another long and painful war in Vietnam, Murphy's words gained new meaning. Young soldiers who returned, broken, found in him not a legend, but a mirror. To them, Audie Murphy wasn't just a hero. He was proof that courage and pain could exist in the same heart. On May 28, 1971, Audie Murphy's life ended the way it had been lived. Abruptly, humbly, without warning. He was flying in a private plane through heavy fog when it crashed into Brush Mountain, Virginia. There were no survivors. He was 45 years old. The news spread quietly at first, then rippled through the country. Newspapers printed the same black and white photo. Murphy in uniform, the Medal of Honor shining on his chest, that faint half-smile that looked more like modesty than pride. At Arlington National Cemetery, thousands gathered. The ceremony was brief. A lone bugle played taps, and the folded flag was placed in the hands of his widow, Pamela. The president ordered full military honors. Men who had once fought beside him stood at attention, tears cutting through years of silence. On his tombstone, carved in simple letters, it reads, Audie L. Murphy, 2nd Lieutenant Infantry, U.S. Army, June 20th, 1925, May 28th, 1971, Medal of Honor. There are no boasts, no mentions of the 33 decorations. No hint of the boy who once stood outside a recruiter's office being told he was too small to serve. Only the name and the truth that every soldier who passes it already knows. Today, his story endures, not because he was the best shot or the bravest fighter, but because he proved that greatness isn't measured in size or strength. It's measured in resolve. The kind of resolve that refuses to yield when the world says, you can't. In the quiet corridors of the National Infantry Museum, his uniform rests behind glass. The fabric is faded, the medals dulled with age. Tourists pass by and whisper his name, but those who stop long enough to read the inscription feel something deeper. That impossible mixture of awe and sorrow that only true courage inspires. Somewhere, a young recruit still hears that old phrase, too small, too weak, too late, and remembers Audie Murphy, the boy who never grew tall enough for the Army's standards, but stood taller than any battlefield could contain. And when that recruit shoulders his pack, tightening the strap against his back, he carries with him the same unspoken promise. That courage is not born from size, it's born from the refusal to stop.